I really appreciated what you had to say and was impressed with how much information you fit into a condensed period of time. And in fact, Minister Holland started asking one of the questions that I had, which was around, you talked about agricultural management, and bringing the animals to the water or the other way around. And in fact, where I live, EOS Eco Energy is doing Climate Change and Renewable Energy Week, and they had a webinar about the Cape Tormentine watershed, and they had done testing, and there were, due to agricultural practices, there were really high levels of phosphorus and E. coli in certain brooks and certain waterways near where I live. I wondered if you could speak more to what you would suggest in terms of, and you can speak to agriculture, but also you mentioned looking at water quality being really piecemeal. Can you speak to the barriers and the issues that you encounter on these topics?
Any ideas? I think, as it applies to sort of effluent standards, DELG relies on self-monitoring a lot of times, and so we have multiple watershed organizations that do a large part of this. There still should be sort of a central, body that really looks at it and tries to deal with sort of problem areas, right? As it is, like, just seeing an issue and doing something about it are sort of two separate things. And right now, like, I don't think too many of sort of the effluent standards are being applied to, agriculture at all. So it's, that really is something that needs to be dealt with. And I think it goes almost directly on DELG in this case to kind of get their act together when it comes to that.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm so glad that you mentioned so many of these things today, because there'll be a report written, and I think we need to make the recommendations back to the legislature based on what you're saying. But what I heard was that it's not just like these specific recommendations, it's also the working relationship, it's that co-management. And I don't want to, and maybe this is following a bit on what Minister Holland was asking, I don't want to put it on you to tell us exactly how it should happen, but what suggestions would you have, or what do you think that could look like when it comes to what difference that would make, having a co-management, having a different way of doing these things?
Well, I mean, there are a few different ways of going about it. One of my ideas over the years has been, like, on the ethnobotanical side of things. We often get caught up in the conversation about buffer zones and allowing cut in buffer zones for economic reasons. Something we can bring to the table is this works both scientifically and from an Indigenous knowledge standpoint, is, there are economic reasons to maintain buffer zones as well. I had mentioned about, natural disasters and how riparian and buffer zones properly maintained can have a really good effect in, staving off major economic decline. But there's also a large economic pool that is more of an economic commons. So we don't see it in the same way that we would see it if we pulled trees out of a buffer. But if we maintain that buffer, the 60 to 70% of the plants that I run into in there that have some use, they have an alternative use. I think that's part of the conversation that we need to be having, changing our attitude a little bit about, holding certain areas in common. And maybe a little bit of managing our buffer zones in a way where there's something that a lot of people have access to rather than just purely pulling out of them for economic reasons.
Yeah.
That's just one example. I mean,
Yeah, I guess that really speaks to just sort of the difference in value systems a bit as well, right? So, you know, he's speaking about sort of alternative uses and things like that. And you know, irregardless of this, you know, these things are alive and they, you know, are there for a reason. You know, the ecological services part of it really isn't something that is taken into consideration when you're talking money. So that's an important part I think we bring to most of those conversations.
And I guess the other point I'd like to just make there with the, you know, the ecosystem services, one of the things we'd like to see in a co-management scenario for, you know, deciding which areas to create protections for, notwithstanding deciding what protection really means, because the Indigenous ideal about what protection means may be different than the idea of what we have in place for example, PNAs at the moment. But ecosystem services, this is something we're behind on in terms of doing environmental accounting. So in a co-management scenario, we would want to have a lot more work done to start looking at the, you know, the intrinsic side of what it is that nature provides through ecosystem services, not just to us, but, you know, to itself as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I find it interesting that we have had to talk about ecosystem services almost in like accounting language, maybe to make it seem like there's value in certain cultures, and like in my culture, and so. But that's the way we're talking about it. And so ecosystem services, like what financial value there is, what protections are there, and I guess it's kind of hidden if you don't know enough about it. But where I've seen it come up a lot is where I live. There's you know, saltwater marshes, and like we are worried about like coastal flooding and other types of flooding. And so that's one of the ecosystem services we think about is like them absorbing, you know, water, absorbing the impacts from a storm, or maybe with you know, trees, the importance of like not clear cutting, impacting flooding. Can you speak to a bit more to that? Because that's not something that we talk about that much here. Can you talk a bit about that value and how that perspective could help? Maybe some examples?
I mean, I think again, if we look back, that's a conversation we need to continue to have with the government of New Brunswick in general, whatever whether it's DNR, DTI, or DELG, getting a little bit better of a grip on what it is that we have to do as, you know, two nations to really decide how we truly account for the economics and when it comes to environmental protections. I mean, there is a body of research that surrounds it. I would have to dig back into it to come up with some good examples for you. But again, the like flood surge protection, I mean, that's something that you want to account for when you're doing that ecosystem services accounting. But then then it becomes a real exercise in how do you actually come up with that monetary figure to figure out what that actual economic value is. And there are ways to figure that out. It's just not an easy undertaking. So it would be something that we would have to do some long-term work together on.
And when it comes to, you know, things that have cultural value too, like there's a real hesitation to ascribe, you know, that monetary value as well. So.
Yeah, I guess that's you know, if we're looking at ecosystem services accounting purely from from the standpoint of, you know, what does this landscape do to protect water quality? We can do the accounting for that. The trouble for us becomes if we start entering into the cultural conversation a little bit. It's a very, it's almost non-existent within the culture to say that some aspect of the culture has a monetary value. And it's something that we as an organization don't do, so.
Well, thank you for giving that context and speaking about that. And thank you again for being here today. I really do appreciate the suggestions you made, the information you shared. And like I said, I hope that this committee will take, you know, what's been presented and that things can move forward and that, and I even heard Minister Holland committing that this isn't the last conversation. So there we go. So thank you again for being here, Woolley One.
Thank you, members, for your questions. And thank you, Mr. Gray and Mr. Toma, for your presentation and answering our questions. It was greatly appreciated. I would like to extend an opportunity for a few closing remarks, if you'd like to state a few words.
I'm not much for closing things.
Yeah, no, I don't think we have too much more to say today, I guess. Just thanks for the opportunity to speak, and hopefully some of the recommendations we see get formalized somehow here in the government.
Yeah, and if, you know, if there needs to be any clarification, hopefully continued dialogue can make some more clarification where we can start to make some good policy decisions together. Thank you.